Tiberius stared at the decree. Beneath the surface, hidden by an unreadable expression he wore like a mask, Tiberius's resentment brewed. What exactly was Germanicus up to? The mutinies had been an unpleasant surprise, but not entirely unexpected. The legions had grievances, of course: length of service, inadequate pay, unfulfilled promises made by Caesar Augustus. But for Tiberius, there was more. The timing of the mutinies was no coincidence. The death of Posthumus Agrippa had cast a long shadow, a shadow Tiberius was keen to keep out of the public eye. He had been careful, very careful, to ensure that any whispers linking the legion's unrest to Agrippa's death were silenced before they could spread. The timing of Agrippa's demise had been curious, to say the least, but it was a matter Tiberius preferred not to dwell on, at least not now. Still, it was no surprise to Tiberius that the mutiny on the Rhine had proven far more troublesome than the one in Pannonia. Germanicus had quelled the rebellion, of course, but not before the situation had nearly spiraled out of control. And why? Likely because Agrippina, the sister of Posthumus Agrippa, had been present. The daughter of Julia, the granddaughter of Augustus, her mere presence was enough to stir the pot. Agrippina had probably played some role, however small, in fanning the flames of unrest. How could she not, when the legions wished to proclaim her husband emperor? But such thoughts were dangerous, and Tiberius pushed them aside. Instead, he needed to focus on maintaining a facade of unity within Rome's imperial family and within the legions. To this end, Tiberius was not only forced to publicly praise Germanicus for his actions before the Senate, but he was obligated to uphold promises which had been made through a forged letter one Germanicus had had the audacity to write. In Pannonia, the mutiny had been settled by Tiberius's biological son, Castor. Although Castor had the help of the Praetorian prefect, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, what he had not done was overreach his authority. As the consul designate, Castor had used only the legal imperium that accompanied his upcoming office, and a letter assuring the legions that Tiberius, once his grief over Augustus's death had ended, would personally lay their grievances before the Senate. But Germanicus had taken a different path. Upon learning of the mutiny, Tiberius had immediately dispatched to Germanicus, through a delegation of senators, the same imperium majestas that he himself had held as the legal heir of Caesar Augustus. This majesty would grant Germanicus the legal authority to take whatever actions he deemed necessary to quell the rioting legions. And yet, when the senators arrived, they discovered that Germanicus had already assumed such authority. He had written a letter and signed it with Tiberius's name. When the delegation of senators finally returned to Rome, they reported the situation to Tiberius. According to their account, the legions, initially placated by Germanicus's authority, erupted once again when they discovered his deception. The soldiers' fury turned violent, with some senators narrowly escaping being stoned by the enraged men. Then, after publicly swearing to kill himself rather than betray his father, Germanicus sent away his wife, Agrippina, and their little boy, whom the soldiers had taken as a mascot and nicknamed Caligula. But the affectionate old soldiers could not bear to lose the little boy, whom they considered their good luck charm. But how could Germanicus trust men who had violently turned against their emperor? He shamed the legions with the knowledge that he considered his wife and child, both descendants of the divine Caesar Augustus, safer with Gauls than with his own men. And so the loyal legions took it upon themselves to weed out the instigators. After those who had provoked the mutiny were put to the sword, the legions returned to order. Then, to give the men something more constructive than seeking out imagined grievances, a common problem when legions were safe and bored, Germanicus offered them an enemy worthy of uniting. He led his forces across the Rhine River, promising the long-awaited vengeance the legions had yearned for since the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest 5 years earlier. Once again, Tiberius bristled, compelled to publicly endorse yet another unilateral decision made by Germanicus, bypassing both his authority as emperor and the authority of the Senate. The tale of how the mutiny had ended, portraying Germanicus as a heroic saviour in the eyes of the Roman people, was a story Tiberius found as frustrating as it was convenient. However, to maintain the facade of unity and to placate public opinion, it was as good a narrative as any. Tiberius stood at the head of the Senate chamber, his gaze sweeping across the gathered senators. The air was thick with expectation as he prepared to recount the outcomes of the mutinies in Pannonia and Germania. However, as Tiberius addressed the Senate, his mother, Livia Drusilla, now officially known as Julia Augusta, hosted the wives of the senators in a parallel event. Rome's senators, many of whom were still inclined to defer to Livia's long political experience, were now additionally awestruck by her new religious stature. Recently elevated to the highest-ranking priestess within the new cult of the divine Augustus, or the Sodales Augustales, Livia's influence extended far beyond her past achievements. To many within the Senate, Tiberius was still new and untested, whereas Livia's influential position as both a revered widow of Caesar Augustus and a religious figure added weight and gravitas to her every word. As they listened to Tiberius speak, the senators passively awaited the opinions of the Augusta, which would be disseminated through their wives, subtly undermining Tiberius's dignitas and auctoritas. Speaking with authority, his voice steady, Tiberius outlined the events that had unfolded. He praised the efforts of both Germanicus and Castor and advocated remedies for the more reasonable grievances voiced by the mutinous legions. Yet, beneath the surface, Tiberius's growing frustrations simmered. Despite the importance of the Senate meeting, the social event hosted by his mother seemed to overshadow his efforts. The senators' attention, while ostensibly focused on Tiberius, was clearly divided. The deference shown to his mother annoyed Tiberius. Her long tenure as Augustus' consort had granted her a level of respect and influence that Tiberius, despite his position as imperator, struggled to match. Still accustomed to Livia's quiet, yet pervasive control over political matters, the Senate seemed reluctant to accept Tiberius's authority without first gauging the Augusta's response. When Tiberius finally concluded his address, the shift in the senator's demeanour was apparent. The lively conversation in the chamber resumed as Rome's conscript fathers eagerly prepared to rush home, more anxious to hear the opinions of Livia's guests than to consider the decisions he, himself, had just laid out. As Tiberius left the Senate chamber, his jaw tightened with frustration. It became increasingly clear that, in addition to managing his ambitious heir, Germanicus, who had shown a troubling propensity to overstep his bounds, Tiberius also needed to contend with his mother's pervasive influence. The shadows of Germanicus and Livia loomed large over every decision he made. Tiberius grappled with how to command the respect of both the legions and the Senate, when his every effort to assert control was being undermined by his own family. The influence of Julia Augusta, his mother, was proving to be a significant problem. For the whole of his life, Tiberius had watched his mother manipulate Caesar Augustus and himself. Now, it would stop. With the mutinies quelled and the Senate's support begrudgingly secured, yet divided between himself and his mother, Tiberius turned his attention inward. Filled with growing unease about the stability of his position and the loyalty of his family, Tiberius took steps to consolidate his power and protect himself. Once again, Tiberius turned to the praetorian prefect, Lucius Aelius Sejanus,